Bien, mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, Madam Minister for the Armed Forces, Mrs. Hall, and myself have the pleasure today of hosting in Paris the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg. And at the same time, we're also hosting the ambassadors of the North Atlantic Council, who we'll be seeing immediately after this press conference. We, the three of us, have had some in-depth discussions this morning. And these discussions took place at a crucial moment, given that France is about to take out the presidency of the Council of the European Union, and President Macron presented to you yesterday the main lines of this presidency. At the same time, NATO is preparing for a very important summit that will take place in Madrid in June, and NATO has launched the review of its strategic concept. And dear Jens, we had an opportunity to talk about it when we last met in Riga on the occasion of our ministerial meeting last week. This morning, we talked about two major issues with the Secretary General, and let me say a few words about both before leaving the floor to Mrs. Parley and then to the Secretary General. First of all, we very much would like the European Union and NATO to complement and reinforce one another and contribute together to the European security. The President of the Republic and the American President recalled these principles in their joint declaration on the 24th of October, and we therefore discussed in details with the Secretary General of NATO. We talked about the priorities of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union in the field of security and defense. We acknowledge a great deal of convergence between our priorities, which is very normal given that the EU and NATO face some common security challenges and, as a matter of fact, also have some 25 member states in common. Our goal is to strengthen the action capabilities of the Europeans in order to answer these developments in our strategic environment. And these efforts, of course, shall ultimately benefit both the EU and NATO. That's the whole purpose of this strategic compass that will be adopted by the European Union in the context of our presidency. In some way, that will be the European White Paper. Together with the Minister for the Armed Forces, Secretary General, we will make sure that in the coming month there will be some close work between the two institutions to make sure to guarantee the coherence of these guidelines in the context, in particular, of the work undertaken by NATO on its strategic concept that will be adopted in Madrid. Of course, each institution is playing its own role, but it is important that we work in the same direction. Then we talked further about Ukraine, which was already discussed in Riga a week ago. We're continuing to closely monitor the situation, and we are daily in contact with our partners. We talked about it with my German counterpart yesterday, and of course the French president will be in a few moments discussing it also with the president of Ukraine. NATO, in this respect, is united, and it is indispensable that we continue to share intelligence within that body. And like I've said very clearly on many occasions, any a challenge on Ukraine's integrity would bring about some massive and strategic consequences. This was already announced by a number of partners over the past few days. Madam Minister, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Minister Jean-Yves. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs just said that this meeting with the Secretary General of NATO and with the ambassadors of the Council of the North Atlantic Council is very topical, given that yesterday President Macron outlined the presidencies of the French presidents of the European Union, and the EU and NATO are both undergoing some major discussions on two key documents, the strategic compass on the one hand and the strategic compass on the other hand. Strategic compass on the other hand. It is true that for too long the relationship between the EU and NATO were loaded with the distancing, if not mistrust. And for too long, the wrong idea was that these two institutions would be competing with one another and that their instruments would be a repetition. But this time is over, because now, given the situation, our security environment, we can no longer allow some useless institutional bickering. We should be working hand in hand and build on the comparative advantages of everyone. NATO remains the basis of our collective defense and the crucible of the interoperability of our forces. And the European Union has a major role to play in order to increase the capacity of the Europeans to face up to their responsibilities in terms of security and defense, to consolidate their defense industrial and technological base, to increase their resilience against threats which are more and more diverse, and I have in mind in particular some cyber attacks or those targeting our satellites. The joint declaration of President Biden and President Macron on the 24th of October shows that there is a shared vision of this European defense that should be both stronger, more operational, and shall also contribute to the global and transatlantic security, while being complementary to NATO. Accordingly, I'm very pleased that the discussions that we just had with the Secretary General, Drian, enable us to give form to these goals. The other topic we discussed today is the role of nuclear deterrence for our defense. In a deteriorated strategic context, which is unstable, we need more than ever some nuclear capabilities in order to preserve peace, to prevent coercive acts, and also to prevent aggressions. More than ever, we need an Atlantic alliance that fully stands by its nature as a credible and united nuclear alliance. More than ever, we need to work in order to contribute to arms control, to disarmament, and to the fight against proliferation. And the workshop organized today in Paris with the ambassadors to NATO will be extremely useful as a reminder. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Drian and Minister Parly, Chair Jean-Yves and Chair Florence. It's great to be back in Paris. Great to see you both again. And France is a strong ally, an ally that contributes to our shared security in many different ways with high-end capabilities. And you invest more than 2% of GDP on defense. Your strategic nuclear forces contribute significantly to the overall security of the alliance, and you are strongly committed to the fight against terrorism with thousands of troops in the Sahel. You also contribute to NATO's Baltic air policing mission and to NATO's multinational battle group in Estonia, one of the 4 battle groups led by Canada, Germany, the US and the UK, which NATO deployed to the east of our lines in response to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. At the same time, we set up NATO's very high readiness joint task force, and next year the French-German brigade will lead that joint task force. Today, in our meeting, we addressed Russia's renewed military build-up in and around Ukraine. This raises tensions and undermines security in Europe. Russia must de-escalate, respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and return to diplomacy. This crisis requires a political and diplomatic solution, so we welcome the dialogue between President Biden and President Putin, as well as the efforts to convene a new meeting in the Normandy format, because dialogue is even more important when tensions are high. NATO allies will continue to consult closely, and we will remain vigilant. and our offer of a meaningful dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council with Russia still stands. Today, we also discussed the importance of working together with like-minded partners in a world which is increasingly dangerous and competitive. The European Union is a strategic partner for NATO, and we have already raised our cooperation to unprecedented levels. We discussed France's priorities for its presidency of the European Council next year, and I count on France's support as we develop a new joint NATO-EU declaration. As I have reiterated many times, I strongly welcome EU efforts on defence. NATO has been calling for more defence spending for many years. I welcome that all European allies have increased their defence budgets, but it is important that we keep up this momentum. So what we need is more resources and better capabilities that can be used by both NATO and the EU, rather than new structures which risk duplicating what we already have. It is also important to recognise the role played by non-EU allies in the defence of Europe and the major commitment that the United States continues to make through NATO to defending our continent. In the last years, the United States has increased its military presence in Europe, and this benefits all of us. Our transatlantic alliance remains the cornerstone of European security because the challenges we face are too big for Europe or America to tackle alone. So, Ministers, Jean-Yves, Florence, thank you for your our excellent discussion and for your strong support to our alliance, and I look forward to continuing to working with both of you. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. We can take 3 questions. As I understand it, we have limited time because we're running very late already. A question from Politico. Did the United States share with you the analysis of Russia's intentions?
Secretary General Stoltenberg, President Biden clearly said yesterday that U.S. troops would not be going to Ukraine and wouldn't be dying for Ukraine. Is it time to clarify, to clearly say that Ukraine won't be joining NATO?
Alors, sur le partage de renseignements,
As to the sharing of intelligence, of course, the allies, and in particular the United States, France and others, do share the intelligence coming out of our various sources. This analysis is permanent. We compare our data. Today, what we can say is that there is, on the one hand, data coming out of what we can see, what we're witnessing, and of course, next there is a discussion as to the interpretation of these data and our interpretation of the alleged intentions of the various partners, or the possible intentions. So it is important, I believe, that we continue with such discussions, but today it would be a little too early to say that we reach any final conclusions on this matter.
So on Ukraine, Ukraine is not a NATO member, so the security guarantees does not apply for Ukraine. But at the same time, Ukraine is a highly valued partner of NATO, and all NATO allies support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And NATO allies also provide support, political support and practical support to Ukraine. With capacity building, training, equipment, and in other ways, NATO allies and NATO support our highly valued partner. And this is also about respecting the sovereignty of a sovereign independent nation in Europe. It has been stated again and again, starting back in the Helsinki Final Act in 1975 and many times since then, that every nation in Europe has the right to choose its own path, and that includes Ukraine. So we stand by our decisions, and nothing has changed when it comes to NATO's approach to Ukraine's membership. And it is for Ukraine to decide its own path, to decide whether it wants to aspire for membership or not, and they aspire for membership. And then it is for the 30 allies to decide when Ukraine is ready to join the alliance. No one else. And this is about really respecting the right of every independent nation to choose its own path. What we see now is that Russia tries to re-establish spheres of influence, where they try to control what neighbors can do. And I myself, I'm coming from a small country bordering Russia. I'm very glad that Paris and London and Washington back in 1949, when we joined, didn't in a way listen to Moscow saying that we should not join, but actually granted Norway the sovereign right to join an alliance because that was our wish. And in the same way, we should respect the wish of every sovereign nation in Europe.
Je complète les propos.
Let me add to what Florence Parly just said by telling you that we have some permanent contacts with the United States as to the situation in Ukraine. And in this respect, later on this evening, I will be seeing Secretary Blinken in Liverpool, and we will in particular discuss this matter.
Bonjour, Brice Dugény, RTL, Madame la Ministre, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
RTL, as the French President recalled yesterday, it is important to have a strong European defense and to work side by side with NATO. So, Secretary General, what do you see as being difficulties or anything incompatible in carrying out this joint work? And ministers, are there any divergences in views among member states as to the European defense?
First of all, I very much support and believe in strengthening the cooperation between NATO and the European Union. And during our meeting, we also discussed how we can do more together. For instance, in cyber, in space, and EU has some unique capabilities that NATO does not have. So we are stronger together when we work together. And therefore, I'm also proud that over the last years, we have been able to lift the NATO-EU cooperation to unprecedented levels. For instance, sharing real-time information on cyber threats, military mobility, also some capability developments. And in Kosovo, we see how NATO troops support the efforts of EU diplomats working hand in hand. We are together in Bosnia, and we have a NATO military or naval presence in the Aegean Sea, where we help to implement the agreement between Turkey and the European Union. So there are many examples, and we need to do more. And I welcome also the strong support in the meeting today for further strengthening the cooperation between NATO and the European Union, including with the new joint declaration between the two EU presidents and me as Secretary General of NATO. Then I have NATO supports, and we have stated also that in, for instance, the communique from the NATO summit in June, from the NATO summit in Brussels, that we support EU efforts on defense. And I support that for many reasons. Also because I know that any meaningful strengthening of the efforts of European allies is to spend more. And actually NATO has been the organization pushing for increased European defense spending for many years. And the good news is that we see that all European allies have started to invest more in defense. And that actually provides more readiness, more capabilities, stronger defenses in Europe. And that's something NATO strongly welcomes, and not only welcomes, but actually has been pushing for many years. We had a decision at the NATO summit in Wales to increase towards 2% of GDP on defense, and now more and more allies meet that target. What we need is more capabilities, and not new structures competing for the same capabilities, and more readiness, more forces, something we strongly welcome. We have the NATO response force. France is leading that force next year, the joint task force, and that shows that European allies are really part of this joint effort. I also welcome and support, for instance, the European Defence Fund and PESCO, because this is about providing capabilities. So more spending, more capabilities is what we really welcome. That will strengthen Europe, it will strengthen NATO, all of us, but not competing and duplicating structures and the message that is undermining the need for the transatlantic bond. Let me just add with one thing, that is that NATO will remain the cornerstone for the defense of Europe. 80% of NATO's defense spending comes from non-EU allies. And it's also about the geography. Norway in the north, Turkey in the south, and in the west, United States, Canada, and UK. Of course, they are important for the defense of Europe altogether. So we have to be together, North America and Europe. That's the best way to preserve peace.
Je vais peut-être compléter en disant que
I might add to what was just said by saying to this issue of complementarity between NATO and the EU's actions can be seen through, of course, each and everyone's sensitivities. Of course, within the European Union, some member states are particularly sensitive to these issues. That's true, and it is also true to the members of the Atlantic Alliance. But what I believe is essential is that we keep in mind the major trends, and the major trends are, first of all, the raising, very clear raising of awareness, in particular over the past few years within the Europeans, as to the necessity of being more and more capable to fully play their role and be in charge of their defense and security. So in this respect, let us recall that the Atlantic Alliance is partly based on the European capabilities, because there's a junction between the members of the Atlantic Alliance and that of the European Union. So everything that is the EU is and will be doing in the future to improve its capacities, like the Secretary General said, the capabilities, this is what matters. Well, all of that will contribute to strengthening NATO itself. There's no doubt in this respect, no doubt whatsoever. So let us look at all that is intended within the strategic compass. That is some further capabilities for us, the Europeans as well, but as well at the disposal of NATO to guarantee as best as we can the stability within our zone. Let me take an example, which I believe is particularly interesting. Beyond the initiatives taken by the European Union to set up a European Defence Fund, which is unprecedented historically. We'd never done it at the European level. And beyond the projects that are being developed within the PESCO, I would like to insist on the space issue. This is the good example to say how we can cooperate in a dynamic and constructive manner within the EU and NATO. It's been many years already since the EU has been involved in the space issue, and we have some dual capabilities in this respect, both at available to the civil institutions and to the military. Over the past few years, we very much acknowledged that the space in itself has become more and more a place for strategic competition. I need not get back to the very unfriendly approaches to some of our satellites by spying satellites. So we need to be able to protect these capabilities. This is essential for our societies, but also because we need it in terms of military capabilities. And in this respect, the Atlantic Alliance is very legitimate in its intent to expand the field of its skills, of its competencies to what is a strategic issue. And this is the reason why we decided to set up a center of excellence, a NATO center of excellence, that will rely on the skills that the Europeans, including France, already developed. So we very much can see that this Center for Excellency that will be located in Toulouse very soon, that can rely on some existing European capabilities put together over the past decades. This is a very good illustration, example of this complementarity, which we will continue to develop in the cyberspace as well and other areas. So in summary, just like I said by way of an introduction, there might have been some discussions, some reluctance or some specific sensibility, but the Europeans are determined, and we will see that on the occasion of the discussions that will come to an end in March on the strategic compass. The Europeans will set their main strategic guidelines, and we can, of course, rely on the complementarity with NATO in this respect. Thank you. One last question, because we're running out of time.
Yes, I'm from Les Echos newspaper. I have a question on the June summit. Could you tell us what are the deliverables that you are working on and where you hope to achieve results? There is now a new strategic concept being developed to look at threats and a strategic compass on the EU side. NATO will be looking at a more global approach, looking at China. This was not part of the initial approach, and we saw during President Biden's visit that there were various nuances between France and yourself.
First of all, regarding the strategic compass, allow me to say the following. The previous question was referring to some potential or possible differences between a number of the European members. What does strike me at the moment is that the first text put on the table, just discussed by the European Council, the Foreign Affairs Council, this first text is the object of a very positive working consensus. So I believe there is a unity that will continue to be expressed all the way till March, and that will be complementary to what NATO is doing on the strategic concept. Regarding the strategic concept, Jens can usefully add to what I'm saying. But let me share a few thoughts with you. First of all, it was indispensable for NATO to review its doctrine. It was adopted a number of years ago. The geostrategic situation is different, so I believe it was useful to have this group of experts that was put together after some sort of a rather strong intervention of President Macron at the time of the summit in London. Useful that we had this group of experts that made some proposals based on its conclusions, and that there were some Horizon 2030 proposals. And all of that will lead to the adoption in Madrid of this new strategic concept. And I believe this is being shared. We need to go back to the fundamentals of the alliance. It is a collective defense alliance. Therefore, and an alliance of collective defense of a space, the Euro-Atlantic space. There is no other space or area. And as far as I'm concerned, in the future strategic concept, we're not considering adding another area, another region. And I believe that the Ukrainian crisis very much underlines the importance of maintaining these fundamentals of NATO, and France will be extremely vigilant in this respect. And I believe that the concept of strategic compass, which we're working on, will confirm strategic concept will confirm this. That being said, when you look at some issues like terrorism or challenged areas Mrs. Parley referred to. There can be some questions as to the role that can be played by some other stakeholders. They're not in the Euro-Atlantic space, but they can play a role. So let us consider it, but that's the other way, that's this way and not the other way around, and things need to be very clear between ourselves, but I believe they are.
I look very much forward to the summit in June in Madrid next year, because I think that's a unique opportunity to reinvigorate the transatlantic bond and the importance of North America and Europe standing together. We live in uncertain, unpredictable times, and in uncertain times we need strong multilateral institutions like NATO, because when we stand together we are safe. Together we represent 50% of the world's GDP and 50% of the world's military might. And we also have an administration in the United States now with President Biden, which is strongly committed to working together with European allies. Then, as Minister Drian mentioned, Jean-Yves mentioned, the strategic concept will be extremely important. We have a strategic concept now that was agreed in 2010. It has served us well, but the world has changed. In the current strategic concept, we refer to Russia as a strategic partner. Then we see Ukraine, and of course that's not the case. China is not mentioned with a single word, and issues like the security consequences of climate change, hybrid cyber is hardly mentioned. And I think that, for instance, climate change is a huge defining issue also when it comes to security. It's a crisis multiplier, and NATO has to address the security consequences of climate change, and I hope that that can be properly reflected in the new strategic concept. Yes, I believe that NATO should have a global outlook, but we should remain an alliance of North America and Europe. But this region faces global threats and challenges. Space, as Minister Parly has referred to many times, that's a truly global challenge, and we saw the reckless downing of a satellite by Russia not so many weeks ago, and we see more and more challenges in space, truly global, but that matters for this region. Cyber is global, terrorism is global. Actually, the fight against terrorism brought NATO to the borders of China in Afghanistan for 20 years. So it's nothing new that this region needs a global approach to address global challenges. And then, of course, the rise of China. We don't regard China as an adversary or an enemy. We need to engage with China on issues like arms control, climate change, but we also need to take into account the security consequences for us here by the rise of China, investing in hypersonic glide vehicles, long range, significantly increasing their nuclear arsenals, and we see them also trying to control critical infrastructure in Europe. And we see that China is coming closer to us in Africa and the Arctic. So, of course, all this matters. And they don't share our values. We see how they crack down on the free independent press. They monitor and control the people in a way we have never seen before, also using artificial intelligence and facial recognition to control their people in a way we've not seen before. All of this matters, and therefore NATO has to address those challenges, remaining a remaining regional alliance of North America and Europe. The last thing I'll mention is that this summit takes place in Madrid, which is in the southern part of the alliance, and we should also look into if NATO can do more addressing the threats and the challenges emanating from the south. NATO has the capabilities, the capacities, we have the structures, tried and tested structures, to provide support to France and all the NATO allies which are fighting terrorism in the Sahel. I don't believe that NATO should have a combat role, but NATO has the possibilities to provide more support, logistical, transport, supplies, capacity building. If so wished by NATO allies, we could provide more support. And I know that Spain, being the host of the summit, are actually looking into if there are some more NATO can do to help addressing the challenges emanating from the south.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.